And joining us now with more on the legal reforms here in Israel is Rabbi Tuly Weisz, founder of Israel 365. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're hearing of protests around the country, critics claiming that the legal reforms are endangering Israel's democracy. Is this criticism justified?
I don't think so. I think that the opposite is the case. Israel has a very robust democracy, and you have a new government that was just elected and demonstrates the will of the people. You have, for the first time in Israeli history, a majority religious government for the first time in right wing. And so the people want the government to pass the legislation that they've campaigned on. And for many years, you had a very secular and almost anti-religious government. So now, for the first time, you have a religious and right-wing government, and you see this hysteria going on with protests that are expanding and expanding. The media seems to be really egging them on, and they are claiming to be protesting in favor of democracy, but in reality, we see here a very robust democracy.
Now, I want to touch upon an article that you've recently written where you call on the pro-Israeli Americans to closely pay attention to what is going on here in Israel with regards to the legal reforms. Why do you feel it's important that they take notice?
So Americans in general care very much about what happens in Israel. Israel and America are very close allies. However, for a majority of Americans who are Christian, Israel represents the biblical heritage that they value so much. And Jerusalem is a place that they care deeply about because the Bible tells them so. Jerusalem is the only city in the Bible that it demands our attention and even our prayers. It says in Psalms, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so millions of Americans, in fact, pray every day for the peace of Jerusalem. There's this understanding that Jerusalem means the city of peace, Yerushalayim, the city of peace. And when Jerusalem is at peace and when Jerusalem is unified, so then the whole world will benefit. But when Jerusalem is disparaged like it is today, then the whole world will suffer, and Americans care very much about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, diving a little bit into the legal reforms here, if we want to compare them, for example, to the U.S. system of justice, aren't the reforms actually bringing Israel closer to the U.S. system of justice in terms of, for example, how we pick judges for the Supreme Court?
In America, you have the system of balances that has the three parties, where the Supreme Court, the judiciary, is independent of the Congress, and then there's the executive who gets to appoint the Supreme Court justices. Here in Israel, you have a very bizarre scenario where the Supreme Court justices appoint themselves. And there is no checks and balances like you have in America, which is why the government is looking to push for judicial reform, which a majority of the country wants. They elected this government. And again, it goes back to the Bible. I think that the Torah establishes a system of checks and balances as well. In ancient biblical times, you had, of course, a king, but you also had a priest and you also had a prophet. The king led the people to war, and the priests led the rituals, and then the prophet had to sometimes rein them both in when necessary, which the prophets often did. And so therefore, the system that you have today, where you have an unelected, undemocratic judiciary that is not it's an unfair system, it's not democratic, and it also flies in the face of the Torah principles.
Now, there does seem to be, though, a pretty broad consensus here in Israel that some reforms are needed, right? Even some of the politicians who are now marching in the opposition, in the protests, they themselves were calling for some kind of overhaul of the judicial system just a few months ago. But I think the question is of the scope of the overhaul. Do you think that perhaps maybe this government has taken it a little bit too far?
Well, I think that, like governments, they need to negotiate, and in politics and in the Knesset, again, there's a very robust system of negotiation and compromise, which of course does need to happen. And that is happening, but this is the very first legislation that this new government is trying to push, and the response is hysterical. And I think that the media really needs to, and the external forces from other governments need to allow the government in Israel to do its thing and to negotiate, like you said, and to argue about the legal complexities. It is a complex legal issue for sure, but the level of hysteria is just out of control.
Now, we talked a little bit about the appointment of judges, but there is another clause that I want to talk about, which is unreasonableness, right? So in Israel, the Supreme Court has a lot of power, and it can strike down laws that they deem unreasonable. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? And is there any other Supreme Court in the world that has this ability?
Well, it's interesting that because Israel doesn't have a constitution, so we're in this situation where the court gets to decide on its own what they consider to be moral or immoral, what they consider to be reasonable or unreasonable. So in America, it's a very different system because of the Constitution. And what's interesting is that when they were forming the State of Israel, so they wanted to have a constitution, and in fact, in the Declaration of Independence, Ben-Gurion even announced that there will be a constitution, but there wasn't. And some say that one of the reasons that there was not a constitution was because, as the Jewish state, the Torah is meant to be our constitution. And so we are not meant to be bound by a man-made constitution. The Jewish state needs to have the Torah. And therefore, it's open. We're left open to be able to form a government here that is not based on a modern or even a man-made constitution, but that is why we're sort of in this situation. There does need to be a better system where the Supreme Court isn't just making up their own morality when they are not representative of the people. Again, you have a very radical activist judiciary over the last few decades that no longer represents the more conservative shift to the right that the Israeli population has been moving over the last number of years.
So drawing inspiration from the Torah. Now, I understand that you've also started a petition calling on Israelis and those around the world to sign in support of Netanyahu's government, you know, with the goal of reaching 1 million signatories. Are you near that goal?
So we just launched it yesterday, and there was 100,000 protesters in Tel Aviv over the weekend who were rallying against Netanyahu, against the conservative government, and against a religious government. And we felt that the only appropriate response was for people all over the world who love Israel, who stand with Israel, that want to encourage the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu to sign the petition. And we want to get 1 million people from all over the world to show encouragement to this government to stand strong and to do what they need to do to lead Israel to be strong, to lead Israel in a strong way and in a fair and democratic way, according to the principles of Judaism and the eternal principles of the Bible.
So drawing inspiration once again from the Torah, Rabbi Tuly Weisz, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.